So, where we left off, we had talked about sort of in the science of ecology, which is the study of living things and their surroundings and how they all interact. Ecology really is about the interaction between things. And so we talked about how we organize things. We have the biosphere, this huge scale that covers the whole earth, then ecosystems, the community and the habitat. We started talking about energy. And we talked about the sun is the main source of energy for all living things. It can all be traced back to the sun. And some organisms can absorb that energy directly and use it to provide themselves with energy. What do we call those organisms? Two words we have for them. Autotroph, or what's the other word? Things that can use the sun's energy directly. It means the same thing as autotroph. Producers. Producers. Autotrophs and producers are the same thing. They can go through photosynthesis. What is a heterotroph then, Joe? So if an autotroph can use the sun to get its energy, what would a heterotroph be?
Oh, to eat.
Yeah, it has to eat other things. It has to eat other organisms to get energy. We are obviously heterotrophs. You have to eat potato chips or Pop-Tarts or cows to get your energy. So autotrophs use the sun's energy directly. And then if you follow the pathway of energy from there, you have herbivores, which eat the plants. I'm sort of an herbivore. Most of you are omnivores. But there's an important principle that when one organism eats another, it's not able to hold on to all of the energy that it ate to grow bigger or to produce more organisms. Typically, when one organism eats another, 90% of the energy is actually not put into making new tissue in the organism. If you eat a 1 pound plant-based burger, are you going to gain a pound of body mass? No. Some of that material you eat is not digestible. Some of the material you eat, you're going to use the energy to keep your body temperature high, to move around, to do all the things to keep your body alive. Typically, only about 10% of what an organism consumes actually can go into making it grow bigger. So each step you move up a food chain, you're losing 90% of the energy. Only 10% makes it to the next level. And so we often kind of depict this with this pyramid diagram. It's called an energy pyramid. And what we find in an energy pyramid is the most energy in an ecosystem is always in the producers. So as an example, see that little forested area out there near the parking lot? If we were able to take every plant that's in that little forested area and measure its mass, would there be a lot? Or let's say this, then we took all of the squirrels that lived in that same area that eat those plants and measured their mass. And then we took the fox that are in there that eat the squirrels and measured their mass. Which of those three things that I just told you, the fox, the squirrel, or the plants out there, would have the greatest mass if you could measure it all? What would you think? Jordan? Think so? Think if I took all the fox in there, they'd weigh more than all the plants and trees? Yeah, the plants. What would probably be next? Squirrels. And then finally would be the foxes. Like, how many foxes do you think could live in that little area there? Maybe one, right? How many squirrels? I don't know. 20? How many plants are in there? Hundreds of plants there. And we find this in just about every ecosystem, that the most energy is stored in the producers. And then they support a somewhat smaller population of herbivores. And they support an even smaller proportion of carnivores. Each step up the food chain you go, you're losing 90% of the energy. So there's just not a lot of energy available as you go up higher. And we show these using these kind of diagrams. These are energy pyramids. They all basically show the same thing, that as we go up the food chain, up trophic levels, we have less and less energy available. It is also why a vegetarian diet is healthier for the planet. Can you put that together? How does this relate to a vegetarian diet being healthier for the planet? Anyone able to make that connection? If you imagine we have a certain amount of land, right? Around here, we have lots of agricultural land, for example. So let's say you drive up Snowden Hill up there, that area. There's some farms up there. And you have 5 acres of land. If you're going to work agriculture on that land, you could grow corn, and you could feed it to people, right? And you could live on corn. Or you could take that corn, you could feed that to cows, and then you could eat the cow. You could feed people from the cows. Which is more efficient use of the land? Jordan?
I think either or, because if you're getting rid of a corn supply to make room for the new corn supply.
Maybe. What about in terms of energy? How much energy could you get from just eating the corn directly? You could get this much. But if you then feed that corn to the cows, they use up lots of energy just being alive. And only 10% of that energy actually goes into growing more muscle mass for the cow. So you're losing 90% of the energy if you're eating the cow rather than eating the corn directly. And so the lower on the food chain a person eats, the less resources it requires to raise the feed for animals to eat. And cows are beef is by far the least efficient meat. Like if you look at a graph of the impact of eating different types of meat, the graph for cows is huge. Then if you go beyond that, the rest are much smaller. Chicken, pork, fish have much lower impacts versus cows. Cows are the worst. All right. So when we think about how species interact with each other in ecosystems, we have these terms we use. These are called symbiotic relationships. They're close relationships between two organisms. And these two organisms either live in or on or depend on each other for different things. So there's 3 types of these relationships. One is called mutualism. This is the nice, happy one. In a mutualistic relationship, both organisms that are involved benefit. They both get something positive. For example, termites. This is a termite. What do termites eat? Any idea? Wood. But actually, they can't digest the wood. The termite itself, almost nothing could digest wood. The termite actually has living in its gut a special type of protist that can digest wood. And so the termite chews up the wood, swallows it, and then this protist actually digests it. The termite gets nutrients from that. The protist gets a nice little area to live in and gets a constant food supply from the termite. That's an example of mutualism. They're both benefiting. They're both getting something positive out of the relationship. Do I have another picture? No. Okay, another example. The Nile crocodile and the Egyptian plover. The Nile crocodile lives in northern Africa. It's a ferocious predator. You would not want to mess with it. However, it opens its mouth super wide and it lets this little Egyptian plover bird go into its mouth, walk around, peck around, and it never eats it. They have a mutualistic relationship. What does the Nile crocodile get out of this relationship? Yeah, it gets like free dental floss, right? This Egyptian plover is pecking little bits of food out of its mouth, keeping its teeth clean, preventing decay, and so forth. What's the Egyptian plover getting? It's getting food. It's getting a meal. Just hops in there, gets a meal. That's mutualism. They're both benefiting from this relationship. We have mutualistic relationship with gut bacteria. We have these bacteria that live in our digestive tract that help us digest all sorts of things that we eat. So we get nutrients from the products of digestion. They get a place to live. They get a constant supply of food. Again, both are benefiting. Another type of relationship is when one organism benefits and then the other is not really affected either way. It doesn't get helped, it doesn't get hurt. So an example of this is a barnacle living on a whale. These are barnacles, okay? They're animals. They have a shell, but they just kind of attach to things and then filter out food from the water. They attach themselves sometimes to whales, and they hitch a ride. As the whale is swimming through the water, the barnacle can filter out little bits of food. It doesn't hurt the whale, doesn't impact it. It doesn't help the whale either, though. So this is called commensalism. One organism benefits, in this case, the barnacle. The other organism is not affected, the whale. And then parasitism. What is a parasite? Can anyone define a parasite? Jordan? A foreign body, something that lives in close association. But what's the key thing that makes it different from the other two things we talked about? Ash? Yes, it harms its what we call host. So parasites, one organism benefits, the other's actually harmed in some way. This is a lamprey. It's a fish, a jawless fish. This is what its mouth looks like. It's got like a sort of suction cup mouth. It's got no jaw. It has these rings of sharp teeth. And actually its tongue is like a drill. What they do is they attach to large fish, like this is a lake trout. They attach to large fish, drill a hole in the side of them, and then live off of the blood of that fish that they're preying upon. It's almost like a large leech that's a vertebrate. When I was in college, one of the classes I took was focused on fish. We had to go out on a fishing boat and collect fish and count them and do all these things. Well, some of the lake trout we brought out of Lake Champlain, some of them had the wound. You could see in these big lake trout, they had a wound where there was once a lamprey attached to them. And we also caught some lamprey. And my professor has like this rubber apron on because he had to gut some of the fish, but he like put the lamprey on his apron and it like immediately like started to suction to it and try to attack. They're kind of crazy looking lamprey. Just another random note. In the same class, I had to go electro fishing. Have you ever heard of electro fishing? So we had to walk through the stream holding these two giant electrodes that you put in the water. When you press the buttons, it sends an electric current and it shocks the fish in the stream and knocks them unconscious. And then your partners usually net them and store them. And then you could count them. You could analyze the fish. And then usually after 5 or 10 minutes, they sort of regain consciousness and you could release them. It's a way of like sampling fish in a stream. You can't like do it for recreation. Like you can't go fishing for, trout and electrofish. You can only do it for like research purposes. But you also have to be careful because sometimes one of your people you're working with might reach in the water to grab a fish or something. And if you have the electrodes on, they'll get a shock. You wear this like big backpack generator and you walk through the stream pressing the probes. Ticks are parasites. Heartworm in dogs. If you have a dog, you give them those little heartworm tablets. I think I talked about this already. To prevent a parasitic worm from infecting their heart. Tapeworms in humans and other organisms. There's lots of examples of parasites. Many organisms are parasites of various species. Any questions about parasitism, commensalism, or mutualism? Okay, let's talk about the cycling of materials. In ecosystems, materials get recycled. Right? If there's a dead squirrel on the side of the road, what happens to it after a few weeks? Seems to disappear, right? What actually happened to it? It didn't disappear.
It rots away.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Decomposes.
Yeah, it decomposes. Bacteria, fungi, basically break down the organic matter in its body and use some for nutrition, and then it returns back to the soil, and that then plants can take in those nutrients and so forth. Those materials that were in that dead squirrel get recycled. Okay.
So like in like November, I seen this like dead squirrel near my house, like around the corner, and like I would walk by it like all the time because I would walk to McDonald's or whatever, and like throughout the whole winter, it did not decompose. It was still there the whole time.
Yeah.
And like last week, it just started decomposing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Why? Why did that happen to the Omar's friend, the squirrel that he walked by every day that was dead? John? Yeah, cold stops the action of decomposer. It's why we refrigerate foods. Like if you took some leftover chicken, if you left it on the counter versus leaving it in the refrigerator, obviously the one on the counter is gonna rot first, because cold slows down the decomposition process. And if it's really, really cold, it stops completely. So that squirrel was frozen all winter long, but then once it thawed out, then decomposers can take over. And probably a squirrel can go from, just killed by a car to basically only bones left in a couple weeks. The bones take longer to break down. They will eventually. Also in college, once one of the courses, I didn't take this course, but in our mammalogy course at UVM, one of the homework assignments is you had to find a roadkill and then take it home and taxidermy it. Basically take out the bones and stuff and stuff it and mount it. And that was one of your homework assignments, to taxidermy a roadkill animal.
I feel like that kind of smell really bad.
Well, you take all basically if you're taxidermy like these things, right? What's actually a part of this deer? Basically, it's just the fur. Everything inside of that was basically removed. You usually build like a structure underneath to support it. The eyes are glass. So basically, most of, and it's preserved with preservative. Most of the fur and some of the connective tissue in the nose and the ears. That's all that's really was a part of that deer. That's what taxidermy is. Same thing with this bird. It's basically the feathers, maybe the bones, but then inside it's stuffed with material to give it its shape. Yes, Fred and Alfred and Fred. I couldn't see from the door. Anyway, Joe? Yeah. The reason I'm bringing all this up is in an ecosystem, materials are constantly being recycled, right? The water you get out of your sink in the morning could have been urine from a wolf somewhere, right? Because water in our ecosystems gets recycled constantly. And carbon is recycled, oxygen, nitrogen, basically any chemical material, any element gets recycled through our ecosystems through different processes. This is an example of the water cycle, right? Water returns to the earth in precipitation, goes back in the atmosphere by evaporation or transpiration. There's runoff. There's all of these processes that basically move the water around, but it's never really destroyed, right? You can't destroy the water. It's constantly being recycled. Same thing with carbon and oxygen. We exhale carbon dioxide. Plants can take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. We breathe in oxygen. These materials are recycled. Here's carbon. Right? Carbon is stored in living tissue, in plants and animals. It's in the atmosphere. Carbon is in the form of carbon dioxide. Our bodies are mostly made of carbon, and it cycles through these processes of respiration and photosynthesis. Nitrogen. Nitrogen is an important nutrient. It gets recycled. Nitrogen is in the atmosphere. Most of our atmosphere is nitrogen, but very few things can actually use it. Only a special type of bacteria can actually take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into a form that's usable. They're called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They live in the roots of certain plants, like legumes and beans and peas. That's why it's good to plant those in your garden, because they enrich the soil with nitrogen. Phosphorus, same thing. Phosphorus cycles through our ecosystem. All of these materials get recycled over and over again. So let's talk about another concept, succession. Imagine your backyard or front yard or any yard. If you stopped mowing it, if somebody stopped mowing your backyard and you came back in a year, what would it look like? If you stopped mowing, what would it look like in a year? Ash?
Just overgrown.
Overgrown. Probably looks just like grasses, but just really long. How about in 5 years? How would it look in 5 years? What might be different about it? Yeah, some like small trees starting to grow, bushes, woodier plants. How about in 100 years? What would your backyard look like 100 years if you stopped doing anything to it? Jordan? Yeah, it'd be a forest. In our area, basically, if you stop disturbing an ecosystem, it will eventually reach a stage as a forest. Right? In our area, it's usually a beech, birch, maple forest. That's something called our climax community. Now, if you went somewhere else, if you went up into the northern part of the Adirondacks and did the same experiment, you wouldn't end up with a beech, birch, maple forest. You probably would end up with a conifer forest because it's a different climate. If you went to the Midwest of the United States and did that experiment, you wouldn't end up in a forest. You'd end up in a grassland. So depending on what the climate is, there's different ecosystems that eventually form. That process, when an ecosystem changes over time, it's called succession. And what happens in succession is one species takes hold and it modifies the environment in some way, allowing new species to come in. And they modify the environment. And then new species. And that continually happens until you reach sort of a final stable stage that we call the climax community. You could even do this. This even happens from bare rock. I don't know, does anyone ever go hiking like on Bald Mountain? So what's the top of Bald Mountain like? Why is it called Bald Mountain? It's basically rock. The top is pretty much exposed bedrock. But if you look like in little sort of divots in the rock, what you'll see is some stuff starting to grow, right? Moss or little tiny grasses and things. That's the process of succession happening because bare rock eventually erodes and it starts to build up a very, very thin layer of soil. Mosses and lichens can grow right on bare rock. And when they die, they start to build up a tiny layer of soil. And then some really small plants can start to move in and start to grow. And then as they grow, die, and decompose, the soil builds up a little bit more. And over hundreds of years, this can go from bare rock to a forest because of that process of succession. And that's what we see here. You know, the first stages are usually annual, like plants, small herbaceous plants, then going into shrubs and woody plants and quick growing trees and eventually hardwood trees. It even happens in ponds. Over time, ponds fill up with sediment and they can eventually go through a process where they fill in completely and you end up with a forest. Things can reset. the ecosystem. Like you mowing or somebody mowing a lawn is basically disturbing the ecosystem, stopping succession from happening and resetting it. Or if you're going to plant a garden, you might dig up all the vegetation so you only expose the soil. Okay? You're disturbing that ecosystem. A fire can reset things in an ecosystem so that succession starts to happen again. So that process is a natural way that ecosystems change over time. And finally, biomes. We talked a little bit about this. I said in our area, because of our climate, an ecosystem that's undisturbed will form a forest basically around here. In our case, it's a deciduous forest, a forest in which the trees lose their leaves in the fall. These are other ecosystem, the tundra. If you go up far into the north of the Arctic and northern Canada, the ecosystem there, the biome we call that, is the tundra. If we go to the southwest United States or sub-Saharan Africa, we have desert biomes. If you go to Central America or Southeast Asia, then we have tropical rainforests. So there's all these various biomes that are present, and they depend on two major factors: the temperature and the precipitation. So if you have a high average temperature and high amount of precipitation, that usually results in a tropical rainforest. If you have a high temperature but less rainfall, you have a tropical seasonal forest, and then a savanna, and then a desert. And so this graph kind of shows you what kinds of biomes form in different climate conditions. All right, I guess I'll finish this. This will be the end of this notepad. Final topic is biodiversity. Do you know what that term means? Biodiversity. Jordan? Yeah, it's basically a diversity of life, that the number of different species that are present in an area are a measurement of its biodiversity. So I was talking about this little forested area out there. That doesn't have a very high biodiversity. There's not too many animals and plant species living there. There's some. If we went to a larger forest, it would have a greater biodiversity. You could have a wider variety of animals and plants living there. And typically, the more different number of species we have in an area, the more stable the ecosystem is. An ecosystem with only a few species is vulnerable to disturbance. It's vulnerable to disease because there's only a few different types of things. And if a disease comes in, it could wipe out all of those organisms. And humans are having a significant impact on the biodiversity of the planet because of how we're using the earth for raising food and so forth, for providing living space for people. We are encroaching on the habitat of many species, and that ends up reducing their biodiversity. And reducing biodiversity disrupts food webs, makes disease more likely to spread, can lead to species becoming extinct. And some of these species could be valuable to us. We're going to do, the state lab involves an example that's based on a real example of scientists discovering a drug to treat cancer in the tropical rainforest, or not in the Pacific Northwest rainforest. They found this chemical compound in a specific tree that lived there that is used today in cancer treatment. Now, if we had destroyed the biodiversity in that area, then we may not have that. So there is value to humans in biodiversity as well. I'm going to skip this last slide. Don't worry about measurements of biodiversity. Any questions about that?